Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session on the 2026 Census topic consultation process. My name is Georgia Chapman, and I'm Acting Program Manager overseeing the 2026 Census Content Project and other household surveys. Presenting with me, I have Andrew Tyson. He is Acting Director of the 2026 Census Content Project. We also have Tanya Hornick, who will be one of our ABS Strategic Partnership Managers, and she will be facilitating the question and answer session at the end. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands we are all meeting across Australia. Specifically, I would like to acknowledge the Palawa people, whose lands I am on today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledging their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the country that I am on. I would also like to acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who are with us today. In today's presentation, we will provide an overview of the 2026 Census topic consultation process. We will specifically focus on how to make a high-quality submission, but we'll also look at the assessment criteria and some other things as well. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and you can ask questions at any point in time. Go to www.pollev.com/2026 Census TC. The URL is on the slide now and will be also on every slide throughout the presentation. Before we delve into the detail of the topic consultation process, let's take a look at what the census is and where it fits into the broader statistical landscape. The census shows how our nation changes over time. It is used by all levels of government, community organisations, businesses, individuals, researchers, and many others to make important decisions. Prior to every census, the Australian Bureau of Statistics makes a recommendation to the Australian government on the topics we think should be included in the 2026 census. We undertake a thorough review process to inform this recommendation. This is so the census remains relevant as we change as a society. If we didn't undertake these reviews, we would be asking you questions on whether you have a flushing toilet or running water, like we did in 1947. We would also be asking you if you had a television set, like we did in the 1960s. More recently, in 2021, we removed the question on internet access in the household. This is due to the increase in mobile internet usage on personal devices outside the home. The 2026 census collected data on a range of topics, and the breadth of these is on the screen. The 2021 review process actually resulted in two new questions: service in the Australian Defence Force and long-term health conditions. With 2021 census data, we were able to see that 1 in 20 households had someone who had served or is currently serving in the Australian Defence Force. Organisations like the Department of Veterans Affairs now know the characteristics of our veterans and current serving members and are able to design services for them and their families. We don't just add or remove questions though, we also make changes. And in 2021, we changed the language spoken at home question to language used at home to reflect that the non-spoken languages used across Australia, like Auslan. Zooming out, it's also important to emphasise that the census is just one of the many ways that the ABS collects and produces data to inform our nation. We produce data on the economy, people, industry, labour, health, environment, and even COVID-19. When we produce our statistics, we start by considering the data need. What sources are already available for us to use, and how to reduce the burden on the public wherever possible. From there, we determine the most appropriate way to collect and produce that data. The reason I'm saying this is because if we identify a high priority data gap that you tell us through this consultation, but we can't include it on the census, there may be other ways we can provide you with that information, and we will be considering it as part of our process. You can learn more about all the statistics we collect on the ABS website.
Okay, so let's take a look at the steps for reviewing topics in the census. And look, while 2026 might seem quite a long way away, it's actually really important we kick off now so that we have an accessible, transparent and rigorous process. We need to have this full process finished by late in 2025 to enable us to start printing our paper forms. It's often said that the census is one of the largest peacetime operations in Australia, and having been through the process a few times myself, I can certainly attest to that. So our public consultation process is going to occur in two phases, commencing now through until July 2023. And phase one is all about making sure we understand Australia's unmet information needs before we get to that point of being able to shortlist topics for inclusion. By mid-2023, we'll report back what we heard during that phase one consultation and commence a second phase that will look at the shortlisted topics for inclusion, change or removal for the 2026 census. Now, once that second phase of consultation closes, we'll continue to assess submissions against a set of assessment criteria, which we'll talk to you more about in due course. Later this year, we'll be releasing the shortlist of topics being considered for testing, alongside those topics that we're not considering progressing further. Now, testing is a really important element of this process, and as you can appreciate, developing successful questions for the census is highly complex. It's because we require all households in Australia to complete the form with limited support. So we need to undertake extensive testing to make sure we can effectively collect data on the topic. And through that process, we undertake focus groups, cognitive interviews, and also a large-scale test later in 2024. Then we get to the point of recommendations to the Minister and tabling of regulations. And it's really important to note that it is actually the government who make the final decision on the topics that are going to be included in the census. So what happens is the government will indicate the planned changes to the census questions, and then they'll be tabled in both houses of Parliament. Then once that's occurred, we'll publish the final list of census topics in late 2025 once the regulations have passed through Parliament. So, look, let's zoom in a little bit more on phase one now. And so this phase is going to be open through until the 28th of April. And in this phase, we're asking what information's needed that's currently not collected in the census and why it's important that it should be collected. Now, so this could be new topics or tweaks to existing topics. It's important to note that submissions are not required in phase one to support the retention of existing topics that will come further down the stream. Now, our submissions can be made via the ABS consultation hub, and we'll be going to that in a little more detail shortly. It's also worth recognising that we're not starting this process with a blank canvas. The phase one process is also going to consider other pieces of evidence that we've obtained in recent times. So this includes correspondence that's been received through the Australian statistician or members of Parliament since we last concluded this topic consultation process midway through 2018. We'll also take into account feedback from recent ABS consultations and statistical standards reviews. We've had a few lately. We've been reviewing the religion standards, ANSCO, which is classification occupation, and also a family standards review. In addition, submissions for the topics shortlisted for further consideration in the 2021 census topic review process, but didn't make it onto the final set of questions on the form, will also be considered. So these include gender identity, more contemporary descriptions of household and family relationships, including those with shared care of children, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural identity, journey to education, and that includes mode of transport and name and address of educational institution, smoking status, and sexual orientation. Now, we've included these submissions from 2021 because we've already received a number of requests from the public regarding the inclusion of these topics on the census, and we are really hoping to reduce the burden on those to have to put in submissions again. So I just want to make it very clear that this does not mean that those topics will automatically be shortlisted for 2026. It just means that people don't need to provide us with that same information again. So what does that actually mean? Let's just summarise that. If you put in a submission in the 2021 census topic process on any of those 6 topics listed, or you provided evidence through another recent consultation, or you sent correspondence to your local Member of Parliament or the Australian statistician, you don't need to put in another submission. You are more than welcome to, however, provide us with another submission if you've got additional information that you think might strengthen the evidence on why we should collect that information. Now, the consultation hub. So as I mentioned, the online submission process is open from now through until the end of April, or the 28th of April. And the consultation hub link there is consult.abs.gov.au. Now, on the overview page, you'll find some background information to our consultation process. And we've been pretty generous. You can actually make up to 10 requests for topics to be included on the census within that one submission. Now, for each topic, you'll be asked to provide a response to a number of questions, and we'll run through those now. So firstly, we're after a brief summary of the information you'd like the ABS to collect and produce statistics on. So you can regard this, I guess, as your headline, and we're really after you explaining in 1 or 2 sentences what information you'll need. Then we want to know what topic the information most relates to. So we'll have a pick list of themes for you to select from, and this helps us understand what's coming in at a glance before we really drill into our in-depth review. Then, why is it important that the ABS collect and produce this information? And I think we will regard this as probably one of those really critical questions that can really distinguish a good submission from a great one. And we'll go into a bit more detail about this in a second, given it's a really important element. We're also then asking about the purposes that you'll use the information for. So this is once again a pick list, and it'll help us better understand the uses of the data. And some of those uses might include things like resource allocations for programs, informing policy and service delivery, or for undertaking research. Finally, we want to know about what's the smallest area of geography you'll use the information for. You can only select one option when you're responding to this question, and it's the smallest area you'll need for your purposes. And you'll probably find that your response to why the information is important should explain why you actually need the information at that geographical level. It's also worth noting you can add attachments at the end of your submission if there's extra information that you think will further support your evidence. Now, consent to publish. You have the option to let the ABS publish your submission at the end of the phase 1 review. So what this means is that others will be able to see what you've provided to us in your own words. Now, you'll be asked if you consent to us publishing your submission before you proceed through the other questions that we've just discussed. But it's also important to know that that consent extends to any attachments you upload as part of your submission. Rest assured, we'll never publish your name or contact details as part of that process. And look, we've got quite a deal more information about that consent to publish process and the privacy of your personal information on the ABS website under the topic review page. So, what's involved in making a high quality submission? So I think one of the most important things we want to get across today is the fact that submissions will be assessed on quality, and one quality submission with a strong case for us to collect the information will be considered more highly than several submissions which only have limited information on how or why they'll use the data. So we'd encourage you to connect with other organisations to provide a consolidated submission. For example, if there's a state government department such as Transport who have a transport-related submission they might be considering putting forward, it might make sense for them to check with other jurisdictions to see if that's also of interest to them. In terms of making a high-quality submission, it's really important that you consider the assessment criteria, and Georgia will be drilling into these shortly. But by considering the criteria, you'll really know what to address when making a submission, and it'll probably also help you identify whether your request is suitable for inclusion in the census or not, and might save you some time in making a submission. The most important thing is to include evidence that demonstrates why it's important that we should collect and produce these statistics. We really want to know how you're going to use the data, and the more specific you can be about that, the better. So, for example, there might be a grant program that your organisation needs a piece of information to strengthen application. It might be that you're designing a service delivery program, or you might be undertaking research. Whatever it is, please try and be specific as possible. Now, I just also want to reiterate that submissions aren't required in phase 1 to retain topics unless you want the ABS to make a change to that topic as it currently stands.
Once we review submissions, we will assess them against a set of criteria. We will also review all the existing topics against the same criteria. Our criteria is based on guidance from the United Nations, and we have also considered how other countries with similar censuses like ours, such as New Zealand and Canada, assess their topics for inclusion in their census. The first thing we do is consider the evidence for why the data is needed. This is criteria 1 to 3, and this is where phase 1 and what you tell us is so important. We will continue to assess the topics which are deemed to have the strongest evidence base. This is criteria 4 to 6 on your screen. In addition to assessing all the topics individually, we will consider if the combination of topics will maintain a high level of public support for the census. This includes the overall size and complexity of the census form, and if collecting data on one topic will impact how the public answers questions on another topic. The first criterion we will consider is whether the topic is of current national importance. This is why the data is needed. This could be for an electoral or legislative purpose. The census underpins our national population estimates, and these are used to determine electoral boundaries, for example. It could also be to support policy development, or if you're a community organisation, your program development or service delivery. It could also be used for research purposes. We look at this criterion because we know we can't meet every need for every submission we get. And this is making sure that we're collecting the most important information for our nation. Even if you aren't sure if your data is of national importance, we would still encourage you to put in a submission. This is because you don't necessarily know what others are putting in, and your submission could form a bigger picture of the national importance across the country. The second criterion, there is a need for data at the national level and either the local level or for small population groups. This criterion is about who you need the data about. So the census is unique as it's one of the only ways that we can get information at the small area level and for small population groups. We need to consider this criterion because if data is only needed at the national or state and territory level, there are other ways that we can produce the information that does not require every household in Australia to take the time out to respond to the question. We also ask whether the data will be used to complement other data sources that you may have to provide richer analysis at this small geographic area or for small population groups. And understanding this, will help us assess the criterion. The third criterion, and the final one that we will look at for phase one, and that is there is likely to be a continuing need for data on the topic following the census. As part of this, we will consider whether it is likely we will need to collect the data in a future census to create a time series. For existing topics, we will look at whether adjusting or removing that question is going to significantly impact a time series that is required for any purpose that we, or for the purposes that the person needs the data for. This is also where we consider whether the responses to the information will still be relevant when we release the data a year after we collect it, or relevant in the period between the censuses, given the census is run every 5 years. For example, data on attitudes or opinions is not usually considered appropriate for a census because attitudes can change much more quickly than other characteristics and may not be as relevant. So we look at those first three criteria and we shortlist, and then the shortlist will be assessed against these final three criteria. I don't have all the subpoints that sit under these right now, but they are on the website. I do want to give you a bit of an overview of what they mean, though. And we don't actually ask you to do anything to help us assess these criteria. That is something that we look at through our own processes and through our testing. But it's really important that you know what we're looking at, so that can help inform whether a topic you want us to collect, whether it's help you understand if you think it's going to be appropriate for the census up front. So criterion 4, there are no other suitable alternative data sources or solutions that could meet the topic need. It's pretty self-explanatory, but here we consider whether there are other possibilities to provide you with that data. And for example, there may be survey or administrative data that will meet the identified needs. We will be once we've done phase one and once we've assessed, we'll actually play back what we've heard, as Andrew said, and we will identify where we have found those alternative data sources if we have. Criterion 5, data on the topic can be collected efficiently. So a topic doesn't necessarily equal a question. One topic might only need one question with a few response categories that are tick box. That doesn't take much time on the space on the form, and doesn't take much time or money to or as much time or money to code or analyze the data. Other topics may require multiple questions or require free text fields to answer those questions to get the data that we need. This increases the time and costs of processing that data. And finally, a representative of the household would be willing and able to answer questions on the topic for each member of the household. So we need to remember that the census is a household form. We need to have questions that are easy for every household to understand, regardless of whether they're in a city, whether they're in regional Australia, or whether they're in remote Australia. We also consider whether the person completing the form on behalf of the household will know the answers to the questions for all the other members of that household. We also need to consider whether people will, on balance, see the value in the ABS collecting the data and be willing to answer the questions accurately. Finally, once we've done all of this, it's important to know that our recommendations are a balancing act. Sometimes the data of highest public value will require more questions or be a bit more complex to answer. It is unlikely that a question or a topic is going to tick every box or tick every box at the highest standard. So we need to make sure that the recommendations we make to the Australian government strike that balance of collecting data of high public value while also ensuring that the census has, as a whole, is easy to complete and not seen as too intrusive.
Thank you so much, Georgia and Andrew. Judging by the amount of questions that we've received so far, there is unquestionably a lot of interest in this 2026 census topic consultation. So with that, I'd like to welcome you both to my virtual couch so that we can start to discuss some of the questions that we've been receiving. Now, before you actually get too comfortable, I will just ask everyone to, if you do have a question, to submit it to pollev.com/2026 census TC. So, Georgia, I'll actually start with you for the first question, if that's okay. With all of this talk about the 2026 census, we've been asked, do you have a date for the final release of the 2021 census data?
Really good question, and a very astute person watching who loves their census data. We do still have some releases that are more complex, and so we are working through them at the moment, but I can tell you that the homelessness estimates from the 2021 census will be released on the 22nd of March this year, so in a couple of weeks' time. We have a publication on understanding the increase in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander counts, and this is planned for release on the 4th of April. And we also have Socioeconomic Index for Areas, or SEIFA, and Distance to Work, which will be released in late April, early May.
Great, thanks so much. It just goes to show how big an operation the census actually is and the wealth of data that's there. Andrew, you talked a lot about the submission process. So one of our viewers has asked, how long will a submission take?
Good question. I think probably the most important thing to reiterate is that we're going to be assessing submissions based on quality. So take as much time as you need to provide us with a quality submission. To help answer that question, you might be interested in checking out some of the resources we have on the website. So there's a submission guide there, and also a really in-depth overview of the assessment criteria that Georgia spoke about earlier. I'd suggest that will really give you a good grasp on the extent to which to pitch your submission. But look, when you are at that point of putting a submission in, just make sure you've got those use cases about why the data is needed, and any other evidence that you think might support your case.
Fabulous. And for anyone who needs a refresher, we will be coming back to where you can source those materials at the end of the session today. So stay tight and keep those questions coming into that PolEV stream. So one of the topics that came up in 2021 census was around gender, and we've had a couple of questions come in around the topic of gender, gender identity, even a separate question on gender diversity. So I was wondering, Georgia, will gender and sexual orientation and even gender diversity questions be on the 2026 census?
Thanks, Tanya. I can't answer that right now, but what I can give you is a bit of that process that we talked about. So if you told us during the 2021 census that you would like a question on gender or sexual orientation, you don't need to put another submission in for this process, and we're automatically going to be considering it. And we've also received other information since the 2021 census consultation process finished on the topics, on these topics. And again, you don't need to put another submission in. So we've also, hasn't really been talked about, but we have also committed to review how information on sex was collected in the 2021 census and what changes might be needed for the 2026 census. So that's what we will be considering. Should this topic get through phase one and be shortlisted as the highest priority topics, we will need to undertake thorough testing, as we do with any topic. And we'll be looking against those criteria 4 to 6, which I talked about, and then having to make an on-balance judgment. And this goes not just for sex, gender, and sexual orientation. It is for any topic. And I think the final thing is, even if we do recommend, it is a decision for the Australian government. So for a range of reasons, I can't answer the question as definitively as I think some of our viewers would like, but we do have a thorough process, and we will be committed to bringing you or sharing where we're up to at each stage of the process, so you understand what's going on at each step.
Thank you, Georgia. Andrew, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Look, the only thing I might add is it's actually New Zealand Census Day today, and I think we can actually learn some things from what other countries are doing, and pay close attention to their experience with data quality and the like, with some new questions, and that might help inform some of our processes too, which is a bonus.
Great, thank you, and we wish our colleagues across the ocean all the very best with their census today. So one of the questions that we've had come in is, could the next census include a question asking about a person's self-assessed happiness? And that's actually based on some research that's also undertaken by some other institutes. So I'll let you decide who would like to contemplate the response to that.
I'm happy to go. So the first thing I would say is it's really important to see broader context than just understanding happiness. It's one of the things we need to do is really understand the need and why it's needed. And so the submission will give much more context for us to be able to make an assessment. But off the top of my head, and this is by no means a definitive statement, the things that I would be wanting us in the review process to consider is, what would the change in that assessment be over time? So this is a point-in-time measure on one night. How much would that change by the time we release the census data? And does that still mean that the data is relevant? So that would probably be one of the things. And we will also look, so if the other data is available, so Hilda do produce this data, what's the need at the local level? So for the person who put this question in, think about those sort of things. Why do we need more data on this, and why do we need it on the census specifically for you to undertake whatever purpose you want it for?
Thanks so much, Georgia, and some great tips on how to ensure you've got the quality aspect ticked off in the census content submission. Andrew, we've actually had someone ask, they're an individual. Is the ABS going to care what they might or have to say about the 2026 census content?
Absolutely. So I think I mentioned earlier, we're really keen to ensure that submissions are considered on quality rather than quantity. But I guess if you're an individual, what I'd encourage you to think about is how what you're proposing, how that data might inform, services, government funding, business planning, or how it might help understand the needs of a small population group. It's important, I think, to note that this process isn't about 1,000 people telling us they want the data. It's about building an evidence base on the national need for the data.
Okay. So another great tip there about everyone's contribution to this process matters, but it's about the national data picture and what that information will contribute to informing decisions. So I'm just wondering, how much change will there be on the 2026 census? You mentioned earlier three changes to 2021.
Would you like me to go, Tanya?
I think you can go, Georgia.
Wonderful. So it's a really hard question. I feel like I'm getting the same, providing you all with the same answer. It's a really hard question to crystal ball right now. And we want to start with casting the net wide so we can understand the breadth of what is needed and make that assessment from scratch. Now, I think I may have said or I may not have said that there are some questions that we just will not be able to change because these underpin our key legislation for the census and under the Census and Statistics Act or other key pieces of work that need to happen. Critically, this would be things for our population estimates. For the rest of it, it's hard to say the extent, and remembering the government makes that decision based on our recommendation. But there are other topics that may become candidates for change or removal if there are higher priority topics that are identified through phase one. So we do need to wait and see what's happening with phase one, and we do need to make that balancing judgment to determine how much we think needs to change. We have 2021 did increase the amount of change than we had for a number of other censuses, so it really depends, I guess, is the answer, and we need to start with casting the net wide.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Andrew,
sorry, just going to add too. It's interesting. The Australian census is one of the longest censuses in the world. Except I did hear this morning that the New Zealand census, which is underway at the moment, might have just overtaken us. So that is a consideration with ensuring that we do really manage that respondent burden and make sure we get really high quality data then people can use for their required purposes.
Great. Thanks for that. So keep those questions coming in to Poll EV, as you can see on the screen for those of us watching live. I was actually wondering, Andrew, we've had some questions come through, so people are really engaged. They've looked at the ABS website already, and they've noticed both in the presentation and on the website that we've said the feedback and outcomes of recent ABS consultations and statistical standards reviews will be incorporated as part of this or are taking place. But where can people find the information about the recent reviews and consultations?
Oh, that's a good question. So the Consultation Hub does actually link off to a number of those consultations. And yeah, Georgia, have you got any further information on that one?
So there's a couple of aspects to this. The Consultation Hub does list all the previous consultations, as Andrew said, and one of the commitments we do have is to put a page up after the consultation, and it can take a little while because we need to analyse what we hear, but it's called a We Ask, You Said, We Did page, and that goes through what we heard from our consultation and what we're doing about it. Now, we have there are a number of other consultations out there at the moment or have recently been undertaken. The religion one is a key one, as is ANSCO, which is the Australian and New Zealand Classification of Occupations, which is currently underway. And these, we are working very closely. We are one ABS, and so we are feeding information backwards and forwards. So if you've provided something to the religion consultation that is actually relevant to census and not just that question or the categories that we put the data out in, that team will provide that to us, and we will factor it into our work program. We'll also be working with the team on any updates they make to their standard of the question to ask in the census, and we'll be considering that the question they ask as part of the standard, and we will be considering that for the census. Same goes with ANSCO or the Family Standards Review or anything that you've provided. We are sharing that, and So you tell us something relevant to them, we will let them know, and they're going to let us know.
Great. Thanks so much, Georgia. So we actually have a lot of interest in the process of how to submit or make a submission. And one of them, Andrew, I'm going to ask you to answer because you are really into this space, is once you've made a submission, is it actually possible to modify the submission after you've pressed the submit button? Just for instance, if I needed to rephrase something.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So once you actually submit, you provide us with your submission, you can't actually edit it. However, you can request us to remove it. I've got the email address you can request that through, which is census.content@abs.gov.au. So we can remove it for you, and then you could then have the ability to resubmit it, but you can't actually edit what you provide us with in that first instance.
Great. So there are opportunities if you need to make some improvements to the quality of your submission, and options for how that will happen. So thank you for that. The other question that I have, and I might go to you, Georgia, first, is about all of the definitions and terms that are currently used in Census. So where might somebody go to find the ABS's definitions of these terms? So for instance, unpaid labour.
Very, very good question, and there are a lot of them. So you can find our definitions that we use in the census, and which is we call census variables on the ABS website. You can go to the census tab, and it's called the Census Dictionary, or I'm sure, but I haven't tested it. You could Google ABS Census Dictionary and get somewhere close, but everything is there, and it is so comprehensive, and I use it quite a bit myself.
Yes, I call it my census Bible, actually, because when you're going through and analysing census data, it really does help you find the information that you're looking for. So we talked about earlier in the presentation about potentially collaborating or partnering with others on our submissions around content. If we are partnering with other organisations for a submission, should everyone submit the response listing each other as partners, or should you just have one organisation submit the response and list all of the partners that are involved?
I think it would be sensible to have the one submission which lists all the partners who are involved in the compilation of it. The online submission form enables you to do that, and obviously then there's some privacy considerations that all those parties to a submission are comfortable with its release if you choose to provide that for public access. It's one of the things that I think people can sort of approach it on a case-by-case basis, whether they, do consolidate information with other parties, but it certainly, I think it's useful from the point of view of ensuring that everyone has got those same priorities, and it'll add to the justification for what's being proposed with a well-rounded submission.
Thank you. Georgia, did you have anything to add? I see you nodding.
Oh, absolutely. I think the one submission will consolidate and help, and there is the option to add a number of other organisations, and if you've got more, add them to that attachment at the end. Add an attachment at the end.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so in the answer on sex, gender and sexuality, there was no reference to variations on sex characteristics. Is this included in the shortlisted topic, particularly in the context of the ABS standard for sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation variables? Georgia, I'll ask you to go to that one, please.
It wasn't entirely clear in my answer, so thank you for clarifying. So variations in sex characteristics will be part of our review of the sex question and how we ask that to get the most value of the data. So just like any of the other things, we do need to test it. We do need to shortlist it, test it. So if you have anything to put in a submission about why you need it to help strengthen the evidence base, I certainly would encourage it. But at the moment, it is already going to be reviewed as part of our look at sex as a topic.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I think that's helped increase the understanding, definitely my understanding of that. If someone has signed a petition, do you actually consider these?
I can answer that if you like, Georgia. So what we probably encourage you to do in that situation would be to attach it to the submission. So we mentioned earlier that, you've got the ability to provide attachments within the consultation hub. So by all means, you're welcome to attach that. I guess it's still important that the submission itself does demonstrate the need for the data, though, and you're providing evidence about how that data is going to be used to inform decisions.
Great, thank you. You talked a lot in the presentation about the process for the consultation and how we will arrive at the content, and the Australian government being the ones who will determine the content of the 2026 census. But who will actually assess the submissions?
I can go. This is the ABS, and we do that against the set of criteria, and then we make that recommendation to government. That's a very simple answer. I hope that actually answers the question for people.
It does. And, it is a big job that you've got ahead of you, just judging by even the amount of interest and questions here today. So by all means, keep your questions coming in to pollev.com/2026 census TC, and we will do our best to answer them all today. But where can I find the list of existing topics that are being considered after consultations and standard reviews? So, Georgia?
Yep, I can go. So the list of existing topics is in that the Census Bible, as Tanya calls it, or the Census Dictionary, if you want to Google it or find it on the website. And that's what we collected in 2021. So we will reassess every single one of those topics against the same criteria as we're assessing any new submissions. Now, we don't expect, as Andrew said, we don't expect you to put a submission in on an existing topic, and we do have that phase 2 consultation. And that'll be mid-year, and that's where we let you know everything we heard from this consultation. So we'll give you a summary of the submissions we received and the shortlist against the criteria, and we'll also identify where we might be changing or removing a topic. And we're including, although the religion consultation was separate, we will be including any changes to the religion question or updates to the family and relationships questions from the family standard as part of that phase 2 consultation. So I would strongly encourage you, if you don't want to make a submission now about something new but want to keep abreast of what we're thinking for the existing topics, strongly encourage you to subscribe for updates, which I believe we will provide a link at the end of this session, but it's also on the ABS website, and you'll get notified when we provide, when we've done our shortlist and you know what we're considering and want more feedback on.
Great, thank you. So I guess, you've talked about you've got phases in the consultation process. So what occurs in phase 1 compared to what will happen in phase 2?
I can start that, Georgia, if you like, and then you can feel free to jump in with extra detail. But I think the nutshell of phase 1 is really around getting a good understanding of all those unmet data needs that are currently out there. And then phase 2 is more about, us considering what we've heard and then determining what we're, considering should be included, changed or removed. And certainly that phase 2 will involve a lot of dialogue with stakeholders. We'll open that up again to the public to contribute their perspectives on what direction we're proposing we take.
Great. Thank you so much. So that's really all the time we have for questions today. And I'd like to thank all of our viewers out there who have generously put their questions to yourselves in really good spirit. And if we didn't get to your question, please email us at census.content@abs.gov.au. So for further information, you can also go to our website, and we've talked about that a lot today. And that address is on the screen, www.abs.gov.au/census/topic-review. You can also subscribe to receive updates regarding the 2026 census consultation process at subscribe.abs.gov.au/2026 census. And you may have gathered that we recorded today's session, and that recording will be made available on the ABS YouTube channel next week. So thank you for attending our session today. We really value your time and your engagement with the 2026 Census Content Consultation.